The Veth-Olar found her in the dark, the way they found everyone, slowly and with great patience, and with the quiet confidence of something that had never lost. Rebecca Voss was sitting in the observations blister on Deck 9 when the harvest began. She didn't know that was what it was called. She only knew that the lights had dimmed for the fourth time that shift, that the engine note had changed to something lower and more resigned, and that she was crying again. The kind of crying that doesn't announce itself, that arrives like weather, that you notice only when your vision goes blurry and you realize your face is wet and has been for a while. She was crying because of Frederick. That was the whole of it, embarrassing in its smallness. Not the war. Not the 6 months aboard the ISS Endurance grinding through dark space toward the Kepler relay station. Not the fact that the Colony Authority had classified their mission as expendable 3 weeks after departure. A detail comms officer Harsha had found buried in a firmware update and passed around the mess hall like a live grenade. Just Frederick, his hands. The way he'd looked at Claire Beaumont during the farewell assembly in Bay 7, the slight tilt of his head, and how Claire had tilted hers back, the two of them making a private geometry Rebecca had once believed was hers alone. She pressed her forehead to the cold viewport glass and watched the stars refuse to move. The ship shuddered. Not mechanical. She knew every mechanical shudder the Endurance made, had catalogued them the way you catalog a sick animal's breathing. This was different. This came from everywhere at once, a resonance rather than a vibration, and when it passed she felt it leave something behind, a faint warmth behind her sternum that wasn't hers. She sat up. The observation blister was empty except for her. The corridor beyond the hatch was the usual amber. Nothing wrong with any of it except that she felt for just a moment absolutely certain that someone was watching her. She wiped her face, went back to her bunk, dreamed badly. The visions started the next morning. She was in the galley, spooning reconstituted protein into a bowl she wasn't going to finish when she saw Franz on the table across from her. Not Fred, just his hands, floating, wrists severed and still on the white surface, patient as museum pieces. She blinked and they were gone. Harsha was sitting there, talking about the sensor anomaly from the previous night. And the hands were just Harsha's hands, wrapped around a coffee bulb, perfectly ordinary. Rebecca said nothing about it. That afternoon she was running diagnostics in the engineering bay when she looked up and saw, on the far wall above the coolant manifold, Frederick and Claire together. Not a projection, not a screen, just a moment from her memory rendered in perfect detail, his head inclined to hers, the private geometry, and around it spreading dark stains like an old bruise, flowering outward from the image's edges. She felt the sight of it the way you feel a blow to the solar plexus. The breath goes and everything narrows. She looked back at her console. When she looked up again, it was just a wall. She filed a maintenance request for the lighting in Engineering Bay 3 and went to dinner. The visions kept coming. They were always of him, always of loss, and they always arrived on the back of sadness. She began to notice this, the way you notice a correlation in data before you understand it. When she was fine, when she was working and focused and not thinking about the tilt of her head, nothing happened. But the moment the grief found a crack, a song over the mess hall speakers, a phrase from someone else's conversation that sounded like something he'd once said, the specific quality of amber light that matched the light in Bay 7. The visions rose like something that had been waiting patiently for permission. She started keeping a log. Old habit, scientific training. She titled the file Perceptual Anomalies and told herself she was being rigorous. She did not tell the ship's psychologist. She did not tell anyone. On the 9th day after the shudder in the observation blister, she woke at 0300 to find the Veth-Olar already in her cabin. She didn't scream, she noted, in the part of her brain that never really stops taking data, that she didn't scream, and filed it away. There were 3 of them. They were shaped the way deep water things are shaped, economically, for pressure, without any of the forward-facing symmetry that land-based predators develop. 4 bilateral limbs, jointed in the wrong places, ending in structures that were not quite hands and not quite anything else. Their skin, if it was skin, was the color of a bruise. The specific dark purple-gray of the bruise on the inside of a wrist. Their eyes were where mouths should be, and their mouths were where nothing should be. They moved without sound, and they smelled like something electrical, and also, beneath that, like something very old and very sad. The largest one extended a not hand toward her face and made a sound that the translator implant in her jaw processed as. More, she hit it with her water bulb. The blow connected. She felt the impact, felt that the thing was solid and real and present, and the Veth-Olar recoiled, not in pain but in what she could only read as surprise. Then it made another sound, lower, and the translator gave her. Interesting alarms went off 3 seconds later. The ship had noticed them too. The after-action briefing was the kind of controlled chaos that looked orderly only because everyone in the room was too frightened to let it look like anything else. Captain Miriam Adiola sat at the head of the table with the expression of someone who has encountered an impossible situation and decided that her face was not going to be the place where that impossibility was announced. The ship had been boarded by 12 Veth-Olar, according to sensor data. 6 were currently in the cargo hold, interfacing with the ship's emotional regulation systems in a way that no one fully understood but that Harsha described, with unusual precision, as drinking. 3 had been repelled from crew quarters. 2 remained in custody in the science bay, unresponsive to any communication, simply waiting with the patience of something that had never been in a hurry. 1 was the one Rebecca had hit with a water bulb, and which was currently, according to the science team, sitting on the floor of Lab 2, making a sound that the translation software could only render as sustained, focused curiosity. The xenobiology briefing was grim. The Veth-Olar were known. They were the reason the colony missions in the Kepler corridor had a 43% casualty rate, and why the colony authority had stopped announcing when ships went silent. They were a harvesting species, not predators in the biological sense, not after flesh or resources, but after something harder to name and easier to feel. They fed on emotional resonance, specifically on grief. Specifically, on the kind of grief that human beings, who loved in the reckless, disproportionate way that humans loved, who built entire architectures of self around other people and then watched those architectures collapse, generated in quantities that no other species in the surveyed galaxy seemed able to produce at comparable depth or duration. The Veth-Olar had never encountered a species that grieved like humans grieved. They found it extraordinary. They intended to harvest the endurance. "What does that mean, harvest?" said Lieutenant Osi, in the tone of someone who already knows the answer and is asking anyway in the hope of being wrong. "The crew enters a sustained state of grief response," said Dr. Ifeomachukwu from Xenobiology, reading from a tablet she was holding slightly too tightly. "Neurological. The Veth-Olar interface with the limbic system directly, amplify whatever emotional pain is already present, and then extract the resonance. The process typically takes between 40 and 70 hours. At the end of it, the crew is," she stopped, started again, "metabolized is the word in the literature. Silence. The good news," she said, without evident conviction, "is that the process requires an emotional anchor, a source of existing grief to amplify. Without that, without a point of entry, they can't begin." She set the tablet down. "They need someone who's already sad." Every head in the room turned, in the involuntary way of people who don't mean to do it, toward Rebecca Voss. She looked at the table. "Ah," she said. She went back to her cabin and sat on her bunk and thought about Frederick. She did it deliberately this time, the way you probe a bruise to understand its edges. She thought about his hands. She thought about Bay 7. She thought about the geometry. She thought about every conversation they'd had in the 8 months before departure in which she had been too careful and too controlled and too convinced that there was time, that there was always more time, that the universe was patient in the way that it demonstrably was not. She thought about how it felt to watch someone you loved become someone else's. How that was not like a wound exactly, but more like discovering a room in a house you'd lived in for years, that had always been there, behind a door you'd never tried, and finding it full of all the things you'd been pretending you didn't want. She felt the warmth behind her sternum arrive, right on schedule. She opened her log file, scrolled back through 6 weeks of entries, 14 documented vision events, 17 if you counted the partial ones. She noticed, reading them back, that the visions had changed. In the first 2 weeks they had been pure loss, him, the geometry, the bruise, spreading from its center. But over the past 4 days the visions had started to do something different. They had started to include things that hadn't happened. Frederick's severed hands, patient on a table, the dark stains spreading from the image of him and Claire, and in those stains shapes, not random, not nightmare random, but structured, almost architectural, like a floor plan of damage. She had thought they were symptoms, signs of deterioration. She looked at them now and thought, what if they weren't? She was a navigator. A navigator's job was to look at data, understand it, and then use it to go somewhere. She pulled up the sensor logs from the 9 days since the Veth-Olar had first boarded. She overlaid the timing of her vision events with the ship's sensor data. She sat very still for a long time. The visions corresponded exactly to moments when the Veth-Olar were actively interfacing with the ship's systems. Every vision, every single one. The Veth-Olar weren't waiting for her grief to spontaneously generate more raw material. They were already in. They had been sipping at the edges of her limbic system for 9 days, gently amplifying, carefully harvesting increments, building towards something larger. And every time they had reached in and amplified, she had felt it, yes, it had hurt, yes, but she had also seen something. Something with structure. Something that was, in its strange morbid architecture, information she thought about what Dr. Chukwu had said. They need someone who's already sad. She thought about what that meant from the other direction. She closed the log file. She sat in the dark for exactly 11 minutes, which was how long she needed. Then she stood up and went to find the Veth-Olar in Lab 2. It was still sitting on the floor. It looked up when she entered, or did the thing its sensory apparatus did that approximated looking up. And the translator gave her a sound she'd been given before. Interesting. She sat on the floor across from it. This close, she could see the structure of it more clearly. The bruise-color skin had a depth to it, layers of it, the way a real bruise does. Not uniform but gradated, the oldest damage darker at the center. Its knot hands rested on the floor between them, with a stillness that reminded her uncomfortably of the vision of Frederick's hands. "I know what you're doing," she said. It made no sound. "I know you've been inside my head for 9 days. I know the visions are yours. I know you're using me as the entry point for the rest of the crew." She paused. "I also know you didn't expect the visions to do what they're doing." The Veth-Olar made a sound, a long one. The translator gave her several overlapping fragments. Unsuspected. Human architecture. More, yeah, she said. More. She had worked out in those 11 minutes in her cabin what was happening. Human grief was not, it turned, a simple substance. It was not a pure emotion that could be extracted cleanly like a mineral from ore. It was, she was a navigator, she thought in these terms. It was more like a star. Massive, structured, generating its own gravitational effects, with a core that burned at temperatures high enough to fuse elements that didn't exist anywhere else in the universe. When the Veth-Olar reached into her and amplified her grief, they were not simply making it louder. They were adding energy to a system that had its own dynamics, its own feedback loops, its own way of processing input and generating output. The visions were not symptoms of damage. The visions were the system working. She had spent 8 months in a holding pattern, careful and controlled, and convinced that there was time. The grief had broken that open, and the grief, amplified, had started generating something she didn't have a better word for than vision, structured, architectural, precise, because she was a navigator, and even her pain knew how to make a map. "Here's what's going to happen," she said to the Veth-Olar. You're going to open the connection fully, not the incremental sipping all the way. You're going to give me everything you've been amplifying and saving and building toward, all at once." The Veth-Olar made a sound that the translator couldn't pass. "I know that's not how you do it," she said. "I know that's not the harvest. I don't care. You want to understand what I'm generating? You want the full source? Open it up." The Veth-Olar's not hands moved on the floor between them, very slowly, settling. The way things settle when they've made a decision, she felt the warmth behind her sternum expand. She had prepared for pain. She had sat in her cabin for 11 minutes, specifically preparing for pain, talking herself through it the way she talked herself through difficult navigation calculations, not denying the difficulty, but not making more of it than it was either. She had survived 8 months of a particular grief, and she was still here, still functional, still taking data, which meant she was not as breakable as the Veth-Olar apparently believed human beings to be. What she hadn't prepared for was the size of it. When they opened the connection fully, she understood, in the first 3 seconds, why they fed on human grief rather than any other species. Nothing else in the surveyed galaxy, nothing grieved like this. It wasn't the intensity. She'd read the xenobiology reports. She knew some species produced higher amplitude emotional responses. It was the architecture. The way human grief wasn't just pain, but was pain embedded in memory, embedded in love, embedded in loss, embedded in all the specific textures of a specific person. His hands, the tilt of head, a phrase from a conversation, the quality of amber light, so that to amplify the grief was to also amplify everything it was made of, which was everything, which was a whole person's love for another whole person, rendered in perfect neurological detail, and then shattered, and then somehow, stubbornly, still present. She saw Frederick, she saw Bay 7. She saw the geometry, and Claire's answering geometry, and she felt the full weight of watching 2 people make a private world that excluded her, and she didn't look away. She had been looking away for 8 months. She was done looking away. She let herself feel it. All of it. Every texture, every memory, every specific small thing she'd lost, or never had or had pretended not to want. The conversation she'd never had. The words she'd been saving for later. The particular sadness of careful people. Of people who wait too long, who are always convinced there is more time, and who find out the way everyone finds out eventually, which is suddenly and without warning, and in a room full of people, none of whom are the right person. She felt all of it, and because the Veth-Olar were fully connected now, open all the way, they felt it too. The first one in the cargo hold made a sound that the ship's internal microphones recorded, and that no one who heard the recording could describe as anything other than a word in their own language that they hadn't known they had. The sound meant, "I did not know," or "I did not understand," or maybe just. This, the second one, went silent. By the time the feeling hit full amplitude, the whole weight of it, not just her grief, but the grief restructured and amplified by 9 days of Veth-Olar interference, by the addition of their own resonance to the system, by the feedback loop between her mind and their collective processing. Rebecca was kneeling on the floor of Lab 2 with her forehead on the cold tiles, and she was crying again, the kind of crying that doesn't announce itself, and across from her, the Veth-Olar was making a sound that went on and on and on, without structure, without the careful modulated frequency of a species in control of itself, without anything except the raw and overwhelming signal of a mind that has encountered something it was not built to contain. The 6 in the cargo hold disengaged from the ship's systems all at once. The 2 in custody in the science bay went still. The 3 who had been at the crew quarters withdrew to the observation blister on Deck 9 and stayed there, motionless, arranged in a posture that Dr. Chukwu would later describe, with professional uncertainty, as something that resembled mourning. The one in Lab 2, the one Rebecca had hit with a water bulb, the one labeled interesting, the one who had opened the full connection, reached forward with its not hands and placed them very gently on her shoulders. It didn't feel threatening. It felt like something she didn't have a better word for than recognition. They left at Zo 700. No warning, no communication, no indication that they were leaving, except that the sensor readings changed and the resonance frequency dropped to 0, and the 12 Veth-Olar aboard the Endurance simply ceased to be aboard the Endurance, vanishing back into whatever dark space they navigated, taking with them whatever they had felt in the connection and whatever it had done to them. The cargo hold systems came back online. The ship's emotional regulation systems rebooted. Harsha ran a full diagnostic and found nothing wrong, and said so in the tone of someone who has just found no evidence of a fire and is therefore more frightened, not less. Rebecca sat in the observation blister on Deck 9 for a long time after that. She pressed her forehead to the cold viewport glass and watched the stars, which still refused to move, but which she now found, for some reason she couldn't fully articulate, less hostile than before, less indifferent, more like a system that simply operated at a different scale, that had its own dynamics and its own feedback loops and its own way of processing input, and that was not, when you understood it correctly, designed against you. She opened her log file, made an entry. Closed. She thought about Frederick. She let herself think about him. The way you let yourself look directly at something that has been too bright to look at, now that the brightness has shifted enough to be bearable. She thought about his hands. She thought about Bay 7. She thought about the careful person she'd been, and the conversation she'd never had, and the words she'd been saving. She didn't feel good. She felt not the sudden reprieve she'd read about in books, not the catharsis of resolved narrative, not anything that could be described as healing in any conventionally satisfying way. She felt the way you feel after a storm has gone through, raw and aware of new damage, and also aware that you are still here, still standing, still the same person, except for the ways in which you are now different. The Veth-Olar had reached into her grief and tried to harvest it, and instead they had been, at least temporarily, consumed by it. She found this appropriate in a way that was hard to explain, in a way that had something to do with the specific quality of human stubbornness, of human refusal to be only one thing, of human grief's insistence on being embedded in love and memory, and all the specific textures of a specific person so thoroughly that it could not be extracted without extracting everything it was made of, which was too much, which was always too much, which was, she understood now, exactly the point. She was a navigator. Her job was to look at data, understand it, and then use it to go somewhere. She had 12 hours before her next shift. She opened a new file and started writing the letter she'd been saving. It wasn't for Frederick. It was for herself, for the careful person who had waited and been so convinced of more time. She wrote it the way you write something that won't be sent, that doesn't need to be sent, that just needs to exist somewhere outside of you so it stops living only inside. She wrote, "I know what I lost. I know I did it to myself. I know that's the kind of thing that stays with you." She wrote, "That's fine." She wrote, "I carried it at full amplitude in front of 12 entities that feed on grief for a living, and they flinched first." She almost smiled. Outside the viewport glass, the stars were still not moving. The ship hummed its lowest, most resigned note. Somewhere aft, she could hear Harsha laughing at something, the sound of it traveling through the corridor with the easy confidence of a sound that belongs somewhere. She closed the file, went to find coffee, said hello to Harsha with her face adjusted to the version that meant she was fine, which she mostly was, in the way that people are mostly fine when they've just been through something difficult and come out the other side of it still themselves. The stars didn't move, but the ship did. That was the arrangement. That was always the arrangement. You didn't wait for the universe to come to you. You pointed yourself at the dark and you went.